Imagine silence, not the artificial, sterile silence of a recording studio or a night apartment, but the silence that is felt physically, like a mass and a pressure. Silence compressed under the weight of millions of tons of scorching quartz sand, limestone, and granite. Silence preserved in untouched repose for 25 centuries, broken only by the faint rustle of falling dust and the distant grinding of tectonic plates somewhere deep below. Saqqara, Egypt, the necropolis of the ancient capital Memphis. A place where the sand is mixed with the bone dust of countless generations. May 2023. A team of elite Egyptian archaeologists, under the personal direct leadership of Dr. Mustafa Waziri, Secretary General of the Supreme Council of Antiquities, stands at the edge of a vertical shaft cut into the rock with obvious engineering precision. The shaft descends into absolute. It is a square well. Its walls bear the marks of copper chisels used by slaves in the Ptolemaic era. The air rising from the depths is heavy and warm. It does not merely smell of old dust. The scent is complex. There's a sweet, almost cloying note, oily and unsettling, like a mixture of oxidized bitumen, cedar oil, natron salts, and human decay. These aromas have not dissipated over 25 centuries. It is the smell of time sealed, the scent of a world long stopped. The archaeologists don respirators, check their safety ropes and gear, switch on headlamps, and begin a careful descent. They descend into the belly of the desert, into that very silence that presses down and draws you in at once. At a depth of 12 meters in a side, roughly hewn but solid burial chamber, they find what tomb robbers elicit. It is not the pharaoh's gold that can be melted down in the roar of furnaces. It is not lapis lazuli or precious gems for which people were killed in the dark alleys of Cairo. It was a long, fragile scroll, tightly rolled and placed in a modest but impeccably carved wooden box beside an anthropoid sarcophagus. At first glance, when the beam of light struck it, it looked more like a piece of rotten wood, ready to the longest, most complete, and best-preserved copy discovered in the past 100 years. 16 meters of concentrated knowledge about death and the afterlife judgment, a scroll on which whole pages of ritual texts are inscribed in clear, unfaded inks, black and red. When the scientists, with the utmost caution, brought the papyrus into the sterile room of the Cairo Museum, carefully placing it in a chamber with controlled humidity, and began to unroll the roll millimeter by millimeter, the atmosphere in the laboratory changed. What at first seemed like a prayer book for jackal and ibis-headed gods quickly proved to be something else entirely. Before them unfolded not an abstract supplication, but a precise technical instruction, a minefield map, the legal protocol of an extraordinarily complex trial, a sequence of actions exacting and merciless. When one of the leading philologists and Egyptologists, attempting to reconstruct the sound of a long-dead language, read one of the key chapters aloud, the room fell into an oppressive, heavy, almost electric silence. People accustomed to mummies, skeletons, and ancient burial rites did not feel an irrational fear of ghosts, but something more concrete and more terrifying by nature. It was as if they had peered into the very core of a human consciousness that had lived thousands of years ago and seen there a primeval, animal, uncontrollable terror of non-existence, and alongside it, a sophistic, convoluted bureaucratic machine of death, devised by that person to outwit the laws of the universe and bargain eternity. The translated passages forced scholars to revise established notions of religion, magic, and the psychology of the ancient world. Now begins the most detailed and thorough investigation of this monument. We will move along the lines of the Papyrus of Waziri as though down the corridors of an endless labyrinth and try to understand why the Book of the Dead actually bears a different name and why it contains almost no words about love, forgiveness, and mercy. Its words do not promise paradise. This is not a benevolent covenant, but a brutal, procedural execution, a court document in which you appear as the accused and the prosecutor is a demon. The sentence is final. The inevitable, irrevocable destruction of your personality. The find in Saqqara was not just news for the wire services, but a genuine sensation for the planet-wide scientific community. For the first time since the beginning of the 20th century, an entire untouched scroll of such length was discovered in its original place, where the priests had laid it. Not on the antique market and not in a private collection, but in a tomb. Officially, it was dubbed the Waziri Papyrus, named after the head of the excavations. However, touching the text, reading its lines, and understanding its content was possible only after months of painstaking work by restorers. The papyrus itself is an organic body, the dried stems of the reed cypress papyrus, which once grew on the Nile's marshes. Over millennia, in the dry and corrosive air of the burial chamber, where temperatures fluctuate, the fibers lost their molecular moisture and turned into something fragile, like cigarette ash or the finest butterfly wing. One wrong movement of the tweezers, a technician's sharp breath, or the slightest change in humidity, and the priceless story will crumble into brown dust that can no longer be gathered or read. To prevent this, scientists employed special methods, ultrasonic humidifiers that created a cold cloud of vapor, chemical solutions for plastination of the fibers, and micro-instruments borrowed from neurosurgeons. Millimeter by millimeter, day by day, with bated breath, they carefully unrolled the scroll and recorded every revealed centimeter with ultra-high-resolution digital cameras in different specs as new columns of dense, neat text appeared, written in a peculiar, almost erotic hand, the quick cursive of priests, distinct from the formal hieroglyphs on temple walls. The first impression shifted. At first it looked like an offbeat, cheap market copy that relatives might buy at the last minute before a funeral, inserting the deceased's name into the provided blanks. But further analysis showed the opposite. What unfolded before the scholars was not a faceless souvenir, but a personal, expensive. This work was a feat of a master calligrapher, and at the same time, something like a VIP pass to the other world. In fact, the term Book of the Dead is merely a modern Gothic cliché, mistaken and imposed by 19th century Western adventurers and treasure hunters, such as Carl Lepsius. The Egyptians themselves called these texts something completely different, and it is their name that contains the key to understanding the ancient mindset. The original designation, Reunu Pertem Keru, that is, chapter about going out to the light of day, or utterance for coming forth by day. It is a message about life and about a kind of afterlife, about the path from darkness into light, about how to unlock the sealed door of the tomb from within. It is an instruction on how to outwit the physical process of decay, a kind of technology against entropy. Ancient Egypt, one might say, was a civilization obsessed with death, but not in love with it. They hated demise, despised it, regarded it as a breach of order, a disease, a mistake before which they trembled to the point of panic. And this scroll became their main instrument, their technological means, their only chance to claw victory back in the eternal struggle against destruction. The scholars were stunned by the incredible detail and completeness of the text. The Waziri Papyrus contained 103 chapters. Spells that had previously been encountered only in fragments on pyramid walls or on mummy wrappings were here written out in full, without truncation, with notes and detailed instructions under. These were no longer poetic turns of phrase but formulas, algorithms encoding reality, the program code of immortality fixed on plant material. And what happened when these lines were read aloud in the linguists, relying on methods of comparative historical reconstruction and on Coptic as the direct descendant of Egyptian, as well as on Afro-Asiatic roots, attempted to recreate the sound of the pharaoh's speech. And it was by no means the soft, lilting language people expect to hear in Hollywood films. The speech of the pharaohs was guttural, rhythmic, harsh, with percussive hissing and rasping consonants. It was the language of deserts and stone, a language of command, not supplication. When Professor Ahmed, the project's lead epigrapher, began reading the 17th spell, one of the most intractable, theologically dense and obscure texts in the scroll, a nearly tangible tension rose in the hall. What sounded in the laboratory could not be mistaken for an ordinary prayer. These were not the humble pleas of an insignificant man to the Almighty. There was no begging for mercy. On the contrary, the text had the tone of a demand, a strict ultimatum, and an open declaration of power. Fragments of the scroll spoke in the first person, "I am Atum. I was alone in Nun, in the primordial ocean of chaos. I am Ra, when he rose, when he began to rule over what he had created." These lines did not express penitent weakness. They proclaimed parity with the gods. The ancient Egyptian practice called Heka differed fundamentally from the kind of magic shown in folk tales or on screen. There were no wands, no sparkling metamorphoses, and no turning mice into carriages. The main instrument of Egyptian magicians was the word, the logos, information itself. The point was that knowledge of the true, secret name, the Ren, conferred absolute control over a being. By name, the spoken word became a tool that altered the structure of reality, much like entering a command in a program reconfigures its operation. It was precisely this nature of the text that explained the powerful psychological effect in the laboratory. The spell, crafted by priests many centuries earlier, was constructed to suppress the will of the listener, whether human, demon, serpent, or deity. It was a Bronze Age neurolinguistic program, honed by tradition and practice. The owner of the papyrus, now deceased, called himself Yahmas in the text, a man in rich robes, possibly a priest or an official. He did not ask the gods for mercy. He did not implore. He asserted his claim to divinity, performing a kind of theological usurpation. His words went into the smallest details. My hair, Nun, my face, Ra, my eyes, Hathor, my ears. He literally dismembered his own identity into parts and rebuilt it from the limbs of the great gods. He turned his mortal, rotting, and fragile body into something like an indestructible mechanism, stitched together from divine flesh. The scientists were struck not only by the aim itself, the pursuit of bodily immortality, but by the tone in which it was proclaimed, an arrogant insolence, blatant aggression, and a complete refusal to be humble. In the face of death, he did not bow. He challenged it, relying on legal loopholes, precedents, and the secret provisions of divine laws. He addressed the universe as a system, declaring, "You cannot touch me, because I am one of you. I know your names. I know your passwords. I am part." This place had nothing in common with the Christian heaven with its angels, nor with the ancient Elysium, where peace and eternal spring reign. The Duat was more like an obstacle course designed by a sophisticated, paranoid, sadistic mind. Everything there seemed surreal and deliberately twisted. The laws of physics either ceased to operate or turned against anyone who dared step inside. In that world, time flowed differently, space folded, and danger. The papyrus described lakes of fire where water boiled and burned the soul of the sinner. Yet the same waters became cool and life-giving for a righteous person who knew the right spells. It described mountains like living beings, capable of turning upside down and hurling a traveler into an abyss of non-existence. There were snakes that spat fire and venom, able to dissolve a person's very essence. Rivers ran backward, along which the sun god's bark sailed and was constantly attacked by demons of chaos. The Waziri Papyrus, like a captive guide, laid out in detail the arrangement of the gates of the Duat. Different traditions named different numbers, 7 gates, 10 gates, or even in some versions, 21. But the meaning was the same. They were sequentially arranged barriers. Beside each of these barriers, in a narrow and oppressive passage, stood a guardian. These guardians were described as demons with knives, with animal heads, and with burning eyes. What struck scholars was not the functions of these beings, but their names. They were not simple titles like gatekeeper or guardian. Their names were carefully chosen psychological triggers designed to evoke in the soul, freshly departed from the body, a paralyzed, he whose home is within snakes, who dances in blood, whose voice is flame, he who severs heads, who devours excrement, who looks back, to pass through the gates and not be torn apart on the spot, not be burned not be swallowed. The deceased had only one hope: to call the guardian by name. I know you. I know your name. Knowledge of the name conferred power. The spoken name deprived the demon of its source of strength. The word bound the monster, turning it from destroyer into obedient servant. An error in sound, a forgotten name, or a slip of the tongue meant not merely death. It meant the second, final death, vanishing without a trace, dissolution into chaos. It was not physical torments that most terrified the ancient Egyptians, but the threat of non-existence. In this sense, the papyrus served not merely as text. It was a crib sheet, a life preserver, a cheat code for passing a deadly level. Scholars who studied these artifacts reached a chilling conclusion. An Egyptian's whole life, all the prayers, all the building of tombs and performance of rituals, was preparation for a single decisive exam. Names were learned by heart from childhood. Monsters were depicted in temples as if one were sharpening techniques before battle. This culture lived in a constant, hidden, and almost obsessive expectation of an inevitable nightmare, and prepared to confront it every second. The climax of the papyrus, its central drama for which the entire text was composed, is contained in chapter 125, the Judgment of Osiris, the Hall of Two Truths, Ma'at. It is a scene familiar to us from hundreds of didactic illustrations. The scales, on one pan of which lies the heart, preserved in a vessel, and on the other an ostrich feather, the symbol of truth and order, a god with a papyrus recording the verdict. Osiris seated. Yet the lines that accompany these images possess a cold, merciless legal precision that makes the blood run cold. This is by no means confession in the Christian or modern sense. The deceased does not admit guilt and does not plead for mercy. He does not weep or beg forgiveness, does not excuse himself with words like, "I was weak, but I believed." Instead, he denies offenses. His words make up the so-called negative confession, the confession of denial. In other words, he either lies before the gods or emphatically asserts his right to be blameless. The list of sins that scholars found in the Papyrus of Azir astonished with its precision, its coverage of all aspects of human life, and its extraordinarily strict morality. It contained 42 mortal sins. For each item, there is a specific judge, a demonic being with a knife in its hand, ready to pronounce sentence. The deceased is obliged to address each of the 42 judges by name. Here again, the magic of the name operates, and a slip is unacceptable. Staring straight at the judge's face, or into what passes for his eyes, the dead must firmly and clearly refute the accusation on each count. The addresses ran like this: "O wide-opening one, who has come from Heliopolis, I have not done evil. O enveloped in flame, who has come from Kerak, I have not stolen. O long-nosed one, who has come from Hermopolis, I have not slandered. O bone-breaker, who has come..." Scholars were also surprised that the moral code of the ancient Egyptians covered not only obvious crimes such as murder, theft of a temple property, and adultery. It included social and emotional offenses, and at times actions that harmed the environment. The papyrus contains protestations. I was not deaf to the truth. I did not cause anyone to weep. I was not arrogant. I did not raise my voice. I did not stop the water in the canal. I did not harm the irrigation. And therein lies the particular horror of the ritual. To lie at such a trial is theoretically impossible, yet sometimes practically necessary for salvation. The heart, the organ of conscience, memory, and emotion, is placed on one pan of the scales. On the other pan is laid the feather of the goddess Ma'at. If the heart proves heavier than the feather because of the weight of sins, lies, hidden passions, and unwept tears, the scales tip. In that instant, an immediate and final verdict follows. On the stage appears a creature whose image and description in the vizier's papyrus are set out with particular detail and naturalism: Ammit, the devourer. She is not a god. No temples were built for her and no prayers offered. She cannot be called a demon in the usual Western sense, nor a fallen angel. Before us stands a functional engine of living terror, an eliminator, a cosmic scavenger of reality's refuse. Her role is to mechanically cleanse the world of defect, of that which did not pass the test for eternity. She is a chimera, made from three of the most formidable predators of African wilderness. Her head is a crocodile's with a gaping maw. The forepart of her body resembles a lion or leopard with sharp claws. The hindquarters are a massive hippopotamus, the Nile's most dangerous inhabitant. Why these animals appear in her form is clear from their behavior in battle. Each symbolizes a particular kind of death the ancient Egyptian might face. The crocodile will drag you into the water and drown you. The lion will rip flesh with claws and fangs. The hippopotamus can trample, breaking bones, and tear a body in two. Taken together, these attributes form an absolute material threat, the embodiment of pain, terror, and physical annihilation. Ammit sits by the scales and waits. She's always hungry and knows no mercy. If the pan holding the heart sinks, the one who pronounces the judgment records the outcome, and Ammit springs for the heart. She does not haul the guilty off to eternal torments and fire. The Egyptians did not endorse the idea of endless torture as a rational expenditure of the universe's forces or the gods' time. Ammit acts more simply and more mercilessly. She eats the heart. The heart consumed by her is destroyed not only physically but metaphysically. Without the heart, it becomes impossible for the bay, the personhood, the soul pictured as a bird, and the ka, the life force, the person's double, to be joined. In that case, the personality ceases to exist, erased from the fabric of being, as if it had never been. The name vanishes from monuments and lists. For a person striving for eternity, and the modern scholars noted with astonishment that the texts contain not a word about forgiveness, mercy, or a defense attorney, no slightest possibility of appeal. There is only the law. Either you are pure. This uncompromising binarity of ancient thought struck humanists with its cold, cynical practicality. It was precisely this part of the papyrus that produced a particular sense of dismay among researchers. It concerns a spell designed to animate inanimate objects and give them the will to act. Chapter 6 describes a special ritual addressed to the so-called Ushabti responders. These figurines, made of faience, wood, stone. For a long time, such miniatures were thought merely to represent servants summoned to keep the deceased company. But the texts themselves assert something else. What we have is a legally framed magical contract. Its essence is this: if the Lord and overseer are called to work in the afterlife, to plow fields, fill canals with water, haul sand from east to west, the Ushabti are addressed on the condition that he will say, "These are not toys or symbols, but substitutes, essentially clones, magical machines, slaves who have taken upon themselves the physical burden of the deceased." The Egyptians imagined the Duat as a space where, on the fields of Heru, in the reed groves of their paradise, labor also awaited. Their paradise was essentially an agrarian utopia. There one had to, but the elite, raised to rule and idleness, even in the afterlife, did not wish to work with their hands. To avoid this fate, the rich and powerful resorted to creating magical substitutes. The papyrus text functioned as an activation code. It was a program that breathed life into a lump of clay, endowing it with consciousness and the obligation to assume hard labor. Contemporary scholars noted the striking pragmatism and cynicism of this approach. It is the embodiment of the ancient idea of the golem, an almost robotic machine, an artificial servant. For the Egyptian, paradise was by no means an endless, idle pastime on a cloud, but an idealized space of eternal labor with gigantic harvests. Wheat there, they believed, grew 3 meters tall. Nevertheless, even in this ideal world, people sought to transfer labor to others, resorting to high magic, and it is precisely this attempt to shirk work that makes them astonishingly like us. They desired immortality, but did not want to exert themselves. Analysis of the texts revealed another unexpected facet. The Book of the Dead is essentially a manual for coping with panic reactions in the afterlife, a kind of psychotherapy for the deceased. Anyone who woke up in the tomb or found themselves at the threshold of the Duat experienced a shock that paralyzed them physically and spiritually. The darkness, the crampedness of the sarcophagus, the lack of air, hunger and thirst, the loss of orientation in time and space. The texts are full of precise bodily naturalistic spells that convey this fear and the attempt to cope with it. Translators were struck by these lines, not so much by their content as by the frank naturalism of the images. The Egyptians felt a panic fear of losing their bearings in the afterlife, and feared that their senses and perceptions would be deceived. They feared that the familiar order of things would collapse, that the world would be turned upside down, that gravity would disappear, and that people would lose their human form and dignity, becoming mad animals that devour filth. They were haunted by another horror, going mad from loneliness and terror in a world where nothing obeyed familiar laws. For them, magic became an instrument for preserving sanity, a way to hold the structure of the self, to preserve memory, and not lose orientation in this irrational, shifting, and changeable realm of the dead. When scholars read these texts, it became clear that they were looking at a document reflecting the deepest psychological trauma of an entire civilization. One could say that the whole culture was built around overcoming the animal fear of decay, chaos, and the loss of personal identity. The papyri also illuminate the close and inseparable link between words and the physical act of mummification, between text and body. Some spells had to be pronounced precisely when the priest wearing an Anubis mask wrapped certain parts of the body or placed amulets on the neck, on the chest, and on the fingers. Phrases like, "May my head not be separated from my neck," or "May my limbs be gathered together," reflect a fear of dismemberment, deeply rooted in the myth of Osiris. In the ancients' view, the mummy was not simply a corpse. It served as a physical anchor for the soul, a base, an airfield, a home port for existence in the afterlife. If the mummy was destroyed, such a soul would not recognize its body and would turn into a wandering ghost or a hungry demon, a danger to the living. The papyrus text and the embalmer's work acted in tandem. The chemistry of resins, natron, cedar, myrrh, and bitumen. Scholars were astonished by the systematicness and complexity of this multi-layered system, which combined physics, chemistry, medicine, and magic into a single strategy for ensuring life after death. The scroll was rolled up with the utmost care under the vigilant supervision of conservators and placed in a special storage facility at the Cairo Museum with climate control and inert nitrogen, as if trying to stop the passage of time. The lights in the laboratory went out, but the words spoken aloud still seemed suspended in the stifled air, echoing in the walls and the minds of those present. "I have done no evil. I am pure. I am pure." These repeated assertions sounded almost like an incantation and would not cease. We deciphered the text, we understood its grammar and vocabulary, we cataloged the pantheon of gods mentioned on the scroll. Yet a question remains that refuses to go away. Were we able to heed its deeper meaning, to grasp the thought and the emotion that mattered to those who created it? Modern humans hide death behind the walls of sterile hospitals and cold. We try not to think about it, pretending it does not exist, living as if infinity were our natural state. The Egyptians, however, faced death openly, face to face, every day of their lives. Preparation for it accompanied them from birth to the end of their journey. This papyrus is a document of their astonishing, almost titanic courage in the face of the unknown, and at the same time a testament to the all-consuming, paralyzing terror that perhaps drove them to erect monumental pyramids. The results of our research shocked the world by revealing how similar 21st century people, iPhones in their pockets, the internet, conversations about flights to Mars, are to those who lived 4,000 years ago. 4,000 years on, we still fear the dark and the unknown. We still want to believe that our actions matter and will somehow be weighed. Deep down, everyone hopes that when, at the end of time, the sands of the Egyptian desert conceal millions more pages of a stone and papyrus library, and we have read only one chapter so far. Now, knowing what words are written there and what power they carry, a dilemma arises. Will we leaf through these texts as carelessly as a morning news? After all, each reading aloud might not be merely an act of learning, but a challenge to the guardians of the thresholds, a kind of activation of a coded mechanism. And who knows, by uttering forgotten names, we may be making ancient powers turn in the darkness and look at us with their burning eyes. The silence of the desert keeps its secrets, but sometimes that silence begins to speak, and its voice sounds relentless, like a verdict. We thank everyone who watched this episode to the end. Your support is incredibly important to us and serves as a source of inspiration to continue our work. We sincerely hope the material was useful and provided you with new ideas or helpful conclusions. Until next time, we look forward to seeing you again.